Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 fan favorites that are all just straight nightmare fuel. Now, even if you've heard or seen one or all of these stories before, keep in mind they've all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so it should feel like a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do the like button's laundry. But when you do a load of their colored clothes, go ahead and just fill it up with a whole bunch of bleach. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's 5 stories. In 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of the ship. They go to the foreman and they say, hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow. The foreman would send a message to his boss that night letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship. So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of the ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did. In July of 2016, a woman living in Chicago, Illinois named Jordan Baranskis opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep on the couch the night before. She looked up and the TV was still on, and then she looked down at the other section of the couch and her boyfriend Matt was also asleep on the couch. As much as she wanted to keep sleeping alongside her boyfriend, she had work that day, so she stood up, turned the TV off, and made her way upstairs to get ready. As soon as she got upstairs, the first thing she did is go into her bedroom and get her purse that she left on the foot of her bed. But when she got in the room, her purse wasn't there. So she leaves her bedroom and she starts searching all the rooms upstairs, and she can't find her purse. And she's thinking to herself, I'm certain I had it the night before. I remember rifling through my purse before going downstairs and starting to fold laundry before ultimately falling asleep on the couch. So after spending about 15 minutes looking for the purse unsuccessfully, and now she's starting to stress because she's going to be late for work because she can't find her purse, she goes downstairs and she wakes Matt up and says, hey, I gotta find my purse. I thought I left it upstairs. Apparently I didn't. Can you help me look for it? Matt rolls over. He doesn't really want to get up because he's pretty tired and he doesn't have work, so he doesn't want to wake up right now. And he says, well, are you sure you didn't leave it at the restaurant last night? I mean, if you already looked, it's probably not here. You want to just give him a call and see if you left it there? Jordan was immediately really annoyed by his reaction because she just wanted him to stand up and help her look for the purse because she had work and he could just go back to sleep. And so it started this argument between the two of them where Matt just wanted her to call the restaurant because he was convinced she had it there, and Jordan was like, no, I know I had my purse. I'm positive I had it last night before I fell asleep on the couch with you. So their argument begins to escalate a little bit, and that's when Jordan remembers that they had recently installed a Nest camera downstairs to monitor their dogs whenever they were gone. And she thought, we can just look at the footage on the Nest camera, we can see me walking into the apartment, and I will either have or not have my purse in my hand. And so Jordan opens up her app and she calls Matt over, and they go back to the night before, right before they left for the restaurant. She's got her purse in hand, they leave the front door, and then several hours go by and they come back in, and very clearly Jordan has her purse in her hand. And Jordan turns to Matt and says, told you so. And Matt's like, okay, fine, let me help you look. And as they're about to put the app down, she realizes on the Nest camera timeline that motion was detected at 3:30 in the morning when they were both clearly asleep on the couch. And so she calls Matt back over and says, here, look, there's motion detected at 3:30 in the morning, and they hit play. After the couple had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, a hooded figure emerges from their upstairs hallway and stands at the top of the stairs and just watches the two of them sleep. Before he left, he stole her purse along with a couple of other things from their apartment. And somehow this guy has never been caught, and he's been given the nickname Creeper Ghost. In early 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in Ossett, which is a small town in central England. Michael was described as a great father and a great husband who had an excellent sense of humor. In fact, neighbors, whenever they would walk past the Taylor household, would say you could often hear the sound of Michael laughing or the sound of him telling jokes to his family. But in April of that year, everything changed for the Taylor family. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. The injury itself was fairly minor, but it resulted in chronic pain. And this chronic pain quickly changed how Michael behaved. Michael went from being this cheerful, funny, happy guy to being sad and depressed. And he was so irritable that his family could barely be around him because he would lash out at them. Now, the Taylor family was not a religious family. However, most families who lived in Ossett at that time were. And so when one of Michael's friends found out about how poorly Michael was doing, they approached Michael and said, you know, you really ought to turn to religion for help and for guidance in this difficult time. And they also told him specifically that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. It was called the Christian Fellowship Group, and all it was a prayer group for Christians who wanted more religious support beyond just going to church on Sundays. But this friend of Michael's told him that the real draw of this group was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson, and she was this 21-year-old, extremely friendly and energetic and charismatic person who just had this incredible way of making all of her members really feel like they belonged. And so Michael's friend was telling him that he really thought Marie could be the difference maker for him, that she could help him get back to normal. And so Michael, you know, he trusted this friend, and he really didn't have much to lose at this point. He was already at rock bottom, and so he agrees to go check this group out. So on September 12th of that year, Michael makes his way to the church where this fellowship group is held. He goes inside and he makes his way to one of the back rooms in the church. And when he goes inside, he sees there's a ring of people sitting in a circle, about 20 people. And as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they all stand up and they open their arms up and they say, "Come on, come sit down with us. Welcome to the group." And then the woman who had to be Marie, she stands up and she looks at Michael, huge smile on her face, and she encourages him to come over and sit right next to me. "Welcome, we'd love to have you join our group." And so Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling as he strides across the room and sits down right next to Marie. And then as Marie began to lead the group in prayer, Michael did not feel his chronic pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. It was like the only place he could be happy was inside of the church at this fellowship group. And so over the next couple of weeks, Michael completely prioritized this group. He went to all of their meetings, and over the course of these couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and apparently Marie became very close with Michael, to the point where the two of them would stay after the meetings were over, and just those two would sequester themselves in quiet prayer. No one knew what they did in there, but it just seemed like they were developing a real relationship. And in fact, many people in this group suspected they were having an affair. And before long, the rumors in the church had spread outside and were all over Osset. And then before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend or a neighbor that apparently Michael was having an affair with Marie. Now, Christine had already suspected her husband was having an affair with Marie because Marie was the only thing Michael talked about when he got home. So on October 1st of that year, only a couple of weeks after Michael had first attended this group, Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, and then Christine hopped in her car and she followed him to the church. And when she got there, she parked her car, she took a deep breath, and then she got out, she made her way to the front doors of the church, and she stormed inside, and she found the room where these meetings were held. She barges in, and she points at her husband, and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie, and you're gonna admit it in front of this whole group." And Michael, who's sitting with his back to his wife in one of the chairs, he stands up, and instead of addressing his wife, who's accused him of infidelity, he turns and looks at Marie on the other side of the room. And when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. She would later say Michael did not look human. He looked like a beast and he had wild eyes. And so as Michael is standing there staring at Marie with this very aggressive face, he began breaking out in tongues. Speaking in tongues is where the speaker will be saying or uttering words or sounds that sound like language, but the speaker doesn't know what they mean. The idea is some entity has come inside of their body and this entity is dictating their speech. And so Michael is broken out in tongues. He's barking these words and sounds at Marie, and everyone inside of the room has no idea what to make of this. Everything has happened so suddenly and it's so surprising. You have the wife suddenly coming in and aggressively accusing her husband of cheating, and Michael is not responding to it and he's acting totally crazy. And then before anyone can do anything, Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. And when he does that, the rest of the members jump on top of him and hold him down. And despite there being like 10 or 15 people holding him down, Michael is still trying to get up and he's screaming and snarling and yelling at Marie. And then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. And it's only then that Michael stops trying to force himself up out of this pig pile that's on top of him, and instead he just continues to speak in tongues to her. And so the two of them are looking at each other speaking in tongues, and the rest of the group is just totally dumbfounded, and so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. It's like he went unconscious. And at that point, everybody in the room just goes silent and they look at Michael, and then Michael kind of opens his eyes and it's almost like he's waking up, and he begins looking around frantically trying to figure out what had just happened. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened to him. And so at this point, Marie would tell him and Christine that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force, and the only thing they could do at this point would be to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is an expulsion or attempted expulsion of a supposedly evil spirit inside of a person or a place. Michael and Christine were at a loss. They had no idea what to do in this situation. They were both kind of in shock for very different reasons, and so they just kind of deferred to Marie's judgment and said, yeah, I think an exorcism is the way to go. So Christine and Michael just leave the church and go home. And then the next morning, Marie would get in touch with the Anglican Church of England and would request an exorcism. And after hearing about what was going on with Michael, the Anglican Church would say, yeah, that does sound like he needs an exorcism. And so the following day, they would send out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. And so Peter and Raymond, they get to Ossett, they go to Michael's house, and they observe him. And very quickly, they determine that it does seem like Michael is possessed by at least one demonic force. And so they tell Michael, the only thing we can do here is perform this exorcism, but we need you to agree to it. And so Michael says, okay, yeah, I agree to this exorcism, and so would his wife, because she at this point is just completely unsure what to do. She's just going along for the ride. So a day later, on October 4th at 10 p.m., Michael, his wife, and the rest of the members of this fellowship group, along with Peter and Raymond, they would all meet at this other church in a neighboring town. And as soon as Michael had been positioned in the middle of this group in this chair, Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. And as soon as they did, Michael began screaming out in tongues, and he began writhing around, and he fell to the ground, and he began contorting his body in grotesque positions, as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were physically harming Michael. And so after 8 hours of this, during which they had to actually tie Michael down to prevent him from hurting other members or hurting himself, after 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. It looked very much like Michael too was exhausted. And as soon as they stopped the ritual, Michael just kind of collapsed on the ground as if he had fallen unconscious. And then at some point he kind of wakes up, he's looking around wildly, he's still tied down to the ground, and he's acting like he has no idea what's just happened. And at this point, Peter and Raymond, they tell him that, the exorcism was mostly successful. We identified 40 demons inside of you, and this exorcism was able to expel 37 of them. So that means there's still 3 demons inside of you. Now, we can't do it right now. We're too tired. You're too exhausted. So go home, get some rest, and tomorrow we will finish this exorcism. We will get rid of those 3 demons, and you will be just fine. And so Michael and Christine, they get their things, and they leave the church, and they head home. A few hours later, around noon, a woman who lived near where Michael Taylor and his family lived thought she heard something strange outside of her house. It sounded like someone yelling. And so she went to the front of the house and she pulled the curtain aside on one of her windows. And outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor. And he was saying something about Satan. And so this woman, she calls the police. The police show up and they find Michael. He had curled up on the sidewalk outside of this woman's house, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. And so the police approach him, and at some point Michael apparently snaps out of it, and he starts looking up at the police like he has no idea what's going on. And eventually they would get him to tell them his name and where he lived. And so after calling in backup to deal with Michael, the responding officers made their way to Michael's residence. And so they go inside, and immediately, as soon as they see what's in there, one of the officers just turns around and runs outside and begins dry heaving. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home from the exorcism, they had gone inside, and then Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. And then at some point she fell to the ground and either was dead or was in the process of dying, at which point Michael jumped on top of her, and using only his hands, he ripped her face off and flung it across the room. And then as she's laying there bleeding to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his body. And then after she had finally died, he tracked down the family dog and killed the dog as well. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack, and so they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for effectively convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. And so ultimately, Michael would be found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after only 4 years of psychiatric care, he was released. And today, he is still living free in Ossett. But despite the legal outcomes of this case, there are many people, both religious and not religious, who believe the Michael Taylor case is one of the only true demonic possession cases in modern history. Also, just to close the loop, we don't know for sure if Michael and Marie were having an affair, but it is assumed they were. It begins here. From the director of It comes It, Welcome to Derry, the chilling new HBO original series exploring one of horror's biggest terrors, Pennywise the Clown. Set in 1960s Derry, Maine, the new HBO original series premieres Sunday, October 26th on HBO Max. Also, you can listen to the official It, Welcome to Derry podcast wherever you get your podcasts. In 1898, a 12-year-old boy was playing at this river that ran near his house. He was out in the forest, he was playing to this river, and he had a bow and arrow, and he was practicing shooting his bow and arrow. And after a little while, he got bored of his bow and arrow, and he went to the stream itself, and he started to build a little dam in the river to try to catch some fish. And as he's building this thing up, he's down on his knees building up this little dam in the river. He notices someone is walking down the river towards him, and he looks up, and he would describe this person as looking normal, a normal-looking stranger. It's a gentleman who shows up. He's wearing a nice suit. He walks over to Wofford, and he apparently just came out of the woods. And he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the boy, he's like, "Oh, I'm making this fish trap." And he's like, "Man, that looks like a lot of work. Like, you should take a break." And the boy's like, "Yeah, I guess I could take a break." And the gentleman just says, "Well, if you want, while you're taking this break, you can come to my house. It's just up past the bend here. My family's there. You can have a meal with us, and then you can come back and you can finish your fish trap." And so, this is a different time. This is the late 1800s, and I'm not suggesting that at the time it was totally cool to go with strangers into weird houses in the forest, but the boy felt compelled to say yes. He didn't want to be rude, and maybe his fear of strangers is less extreme than it is, for us today in 2020. And so he agrees to go with the man. They make their way up past the river into the forest a little bit, and they come up to this cabin. Now, the boy played in the woods here, and he had never seen this house before. But he's not too concerned, because as soon as he gets to the house, this cabin in the woods, he sees that the lights are on, and he hears kids playing inside, and a close family friend of his family's is sitting on the porch talking to one of the other apparently family members of the stranger. And so the boy's put at ease, and he says hi to the family friend, and the family friend, waves back. The boy goes inside, and he sees that this family has a couple of kids, roughly his age. They're playing, goofing around. They have dinner, and this wonderful meal, and the boy, Wofford, is like, "Man, this is so great." And after the meal, he lays down and falls asleep. He kind of loses track of time. The boy falls asleep at this cabin. And so he wakes up early the next morning, and he feels horrible because he didn't mean to fall asleep, and he didn't tell anyone from his family where he was going. And he's thinking, "Man, they're going to be so worried about me." And so as he's getting up to leave, the stranger is already awake, the one that had met him down by the river and called him up to the house. And the boy says, "Hey, can you walk me down back to the river?" And the stranger's like, "I can take you part of the way down, sure." So the two of them, they're having small talk, and the boy's thanking the man for his generosity. And so as they're walking, they're passing by an orchard on one side and a cornfield on the other. And it's this beautiful morning, the sun's just coming up, and the boy remembers thinking how beautiful the setting was. But he also was thinking, like, I don't even know where I am right now. And I'm assuming he's walking me back to where I live, but this doesn't look familiar at all. And the stranger stops. They get to almost a junction right at the end of the orchard and of the cornfield. And the stranger tells the boy, Wofford, he says, "Hey, just go straight. You're going to turn down this way, turn back, and you'll be at the river again where we met." And the boy thanks the stranger, and the stranger turns and starts walking back towards his cabin and says, "Hey, good luck, see ya." And the boy starts following the man's directions. And Wofford, as he's walking, following the stranger's directions, he's suddenly curious and turns around to look back at this strange person who had brought him up to the house and then now brought him back. And he's stunned because suddenly the orchard and the cornfield are not there. There is no orchard or cornfield. It's just deep, dark forest. And he's like, "What's going on?" He turns back, and there's a search party, or it looks like a search party, running up to him. Part of the search party is the family friend that he had seen at the house. And the boy's like looking at these people running towards him, like they're running to him. And he recognizes the family friend, and he can tell they're like urgently looking for him. And he felt bad because he knows he slept over through the night. So he's like, hey, I'm here. And they're like, where have you been? And the boy turns to the family friend and he's like, didn't you tell them I was with you? And the family friend is like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, the house with the family. We ate dinner together last night. And the guy, the family friend, is like, I've been looking for you for the past several days. I've been with your family looking for you. You've been gone for 3 days. And the boy is like, what? And as he's describing the kind of general vicinity of where this cabin was, he's kind of pointing back up towards where it was and describing it from where the river was. The family says to him that since you've been missing, we've heard rhythmic drumming non-stop coming from the section of the forest that you just described. We can never pinpoint where it was coming from. And now that you just showed up, the drumming has stopped. And so the kid's terrified, but there's no answers. Pretty creepy. By early 1999, Christopher Case was living his best life. He was 35 years old. He had moved out to Seattle to pursue a career in music, and he had landed a job at a music company in Seattle, and he had risen to the rank of executive at that company. He was incredibly fit. He was known for being at the gym 7 days a week. He took vitamins. He took his health very seriously. He had loads of friends. People really liked him. He was very close with his family. And, despite all that, despite his popularity and success, he had been single for years. And even though he was not actively seeking a companion, his friends and family were continuously trying to set him up on dates. But Chris would prefer to not go on a date and actually stay home by himself and listen to music, because Chris had an obsession with a very specific type of music. He loved music from ancient times, specifically from Egypt. And so he would stay home instead of go out on dates and, crush ancient Egyptian music. That was like his idea of a great night. On April 11th of 1999, Chris was on a business trip because part of his job required a ton of travel. And he was on a trip with a couple of his coworkers, who were also friends of his. They go out to San Francisco, and on the 11th, they decide to go out for dinner that night. And one of his coworkers decides to bring along a friend who was someone that lived in the area. So they get to dinner, and one of them has their friend, who's an older woman, very attractive, very kind of intense looking woman. She was about 20 years older than Chris. That was his guess. And she sits down, and the four of them are just kind of having a nice conversation. And at some point, the older woman really takes an interest in Chris. And Chris takes an interest in her because it would turn out that they had a lot in common. And then she actually admitted to him that she was really into music from ancient times and actually has a specific interest in music from ancient Egypt. And so to Chris, he's like, how can this be? And he's like, this is my passion. I love that type of music. And they really hit it off. Now, Chris was not looking for any sort of romantic involvement with this woman. He was just so excited to talk about something he loved. And so all night, Chris and this older woman are chatting it up and they're super into each other. He was looking at her purely from a platonic sense, but it was becoming clear by the end of the night, at least Chris was realizing this, that she was looking at him with a romantic angle. She was interested in Chris. And in fact, right as he's kind of realizing this, she asks him if he wants to leave with her and go back to her place. And he politely declines because he's not interested. He loved chatting with her about music and other things they had in common, but he wasn't interested in her romantically. And she became a little bit more aggressive and said, no, come on, let's get out of here. I got a place right down the road. We can go listen to music and hang out in my place. And he felt really uncomfortable and he kept saying no, but she wouldn't let it go. And so finally, as she's literally trying to get him to say yes, he says, hey, you know what? I've had a long night. I'm going to go. And so he stands up to leave, and the woman goes from being very flirtatious and friendly to very angry at Chris. And she looks at him and kind of abruptly says to him,
I'm actually a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you. You're going to be dead within a week.
Okay. And he just leaves. So the next morning, on April 12th, Chris gets up and he heads to the airport and he flies back to Seattle. When he lands in Seattle, he calls his friend Sammy, who was one of his very close friends back when he lived on the East Coast. He just wanted to share this weird experience with a close friend, and so they're kind of laughing about the whole thing. Neither of them are taking the curse seriously at all. It was like, you really dodged a bullet. It's good you did not go home with her. So in good spirits, Chris hangs up the phone with Sammy, and for the next 24 hours, Chris would fall right back into his regular daily life in Seattle. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. But all that would change starting the night of April 13th, which would have been 48 hours after his encounter with this woman in San Francisco. So Chris lives alone. He doesn't have pets. And he gets into bed that night and he's laying there, and before he falls asleep, he hears whispering coming from outside of his bedroom in the kitchen area, kind of near the front door. And he's thinking to himself, like, I didn't just hear whispering. Like, what? No one's in here. What's going on? And he's hearing the whispering, and then it kind of stops. And before he gets up to investigate, he's like, okay, I probably was just hearing things. That wasn't real. He's just kind of laying there trying to go to sleep, and then he hears it again. Except now it's not coming from the kitchen area. It's coming from a separate area in his apartment outside of the room he's in. And so now he's wondering, like, did someone sneak into my house? Like, is there a burglar in my house right now? And so he quietly gets out of his bed and he walks over to his door, he opens it up, and he can still hear the whispering, and it's coming from like his laundry room a little ways away. But as soon as he opens the door and he pokes his head out, the whispering stops. And he's just standing there, like, looking around, like hoping that there isn't anything in his apartment. And then out of the corner of his eye, near the front door, he sees something dash across his periphery. Like a shadowy figure basically darts across the room. And so he looks over, and he's immediately afraid that it really is a burglar in his room. And as he's looking, he's turning the light on next to him, he's looking around, and he starts hearing the whispering again, and now it's coming from another section of his house. So he just starts turning on all the lights and looking around to try to, like, make sure no one's in his apartment. He's not even thinking about the whispering. He's just looking for this shadowy figure that he saw run past him. And so he's looking all over his apartment. All the lights are on. It's a small apartment. And as soon as he feels comfortable that the door's locked still, everything's locked, and there's nobody here, that's when he realizes that whispering is still happening. And so he turns back around, and now the whispering's coming from his bedroom where he was. And so he walks over to his bedroom and looks inside, and he can't pinpoint the whispering. Like, he keeps hearing it and walking to wherever it's coming from, and as soon as he gets near it, the whispering stops. And he's thinking to himself, like, am I dreaming? Is this a dream? Am I losing my mind? Did somebody slip me something, like, last night? Like, what's wrong with me? So he has this horrible night where he's up all night chasing down whispers in his apartment that keep vanishing, and then seeing shadowy figures running around and lurking in corners, but he can't ever see them when he looks at them. And so the next morning on April 14th, when the sun comes up, he hasn't slept, the first phone call he makes is to Sammy, his friend. And he's totally panicked, and we know about this phone call because Sammy would tell police about all her interactions with Chris over the course of this week. She would say that he was totally panicked. And she even thought, as she's taking this phone call, that it's just so weird, that Chris is scared of noises in his apartment and, like, figures moving around in his apartment, because it's so unlike Chris. He's, definitely a skeptic. He's just like he's a no BS kind of guy. So the idea that he would suddenly be terrified of something paranormal running around his apartment just seems so unlike him. But as she's listening to him, he was so scared about what was in his apartment. He knew it wasn't a person because he looked everywhere. There was no people. And that's the only reason he didn't call the police, is because he didn't want to tell the police that some shadow figure that's whispering in my apartment is harassing me. Like, what are the police gonna do? So Sammy hangs up the phone with Chris after trying to reassure him, and just hopes that whatever that was doesn't happen again. But unfortunately for Chris, the night of the 14th now, he's going to bed again, and he starts hearing the whispers, and immediately he's out there looking, lights on. He's looking for these whispers. They keep disappearing. He can't find the source. He's getting frustrated. He's scared. He keeps seeing that thing dart around his apartment. Except this night, he also noticed that he would look, and he could get close enough to where he could break out the silhouette of what looked like a person, like lingering in the corner of his apartment, but he'd go closer to it and it would disappear. It was like the manifestations of what he was seeing, the whispers and this figure running around his apartment, were becoming more vivid. But he's also thinking, like, I didn't sleep the night before. This could be my imagination. Like, I don't know if this is happening, but he's spiraling and he knows it. So the next day on the 15th, he doesn't call Sammy, but he calls a couple of his other friends that are anonymous, and they would all tell police that they got a similar story that Sammy had gotten that first night after the 14th. No matter what was happening, Chris believed it was happening, and Chris was terrified. But this wasn't even the worst of it yet. So that night on the 15th, Chris gets in bed, and now he's barely slept for 2 consecutive nights. And he's determined to just go to sleep. That he's trying to tell himself that everything that you've experienced the past couple nights is probably brought on by stress. It's brought on by now certainly a lack of sleep. So he's telling himself, like, just go to sleep. Just get in bed and go to sleep. So he gets in bed and he's laying there and he does fall asleep. But he wakes up in the middle of the night and he can't move his body. He's paralyzed. He can't move, and he's totally awake. And he starts hearing whispering. And now his level of fear is so high because now he's immobile. But the past 2 nights he's heard that whispering in his apartment, and he's seen that figure moving around his apartment. And so he's laying there in darkness because he went to bed in darkness. And he starts hearing whispering outside his room, and then it stops. And then he starts hearing whispering inside of his closet, and then it stops. And then he hears whispering right underneath his bed, and he can't move. And he's just laying there praying that nothing horrible is going to happen to him, that this is just a dream. And then out from underneath his bed, right next to him, he can only turn his eyes. This black figure, this shadowy black figure emerges right next to his bed. And it's looking down at him. He can't make out any facial expressions, but he can clearly define, a figure is hovering over him. And it reaches down and puts its hands around his neck and begins to throttle him. And Chris is like gagging. He can't breathe, but he can't move. And at some point, the thing begins to lift him off of his bed by his neck and then throws him back down. And then the figure vanishes. Chris still couldn't move. He's choking to breathe, but he can't move. And he's just waiting for this thing to come back. And he knows that more than likely, whatever this is probably going to kill him this night. So he's laying there just thinking, oh my God, I'm about to die. I'm about to die. But the thing doesn't come back, and Chris can't move. And at some point, Chris, probably out of just pure, adrenaline crash or something, he falls asleep. And so when Chris wakes up and he can move again, he notices there's blood inside of his bed on his sheets. And then he looks at his hands, and at the tips of all 10 fingers are these incisions, like someone had intentionally cut open the top of every finger, something he certainly didn't do. And his bed is covered in blood from these 10 cuts on his hands. And then he feels his neck, and it feels tender. And it turns out he had marks in his neck. It was all bruised up from this thing choking him out. And it brought him back to that really happened. He's now actually in fear for his life. Chris immediately calls Sammy and tells Sammy everything that happened. And Sammy can't believe any of it. She felt helpless because she's on the other side of the country. She can't help him. And Chris is just petrified. And he's he can barely speak, he's unable to articulate what's happening. He's describing these cuts on his hand and his neck, but there's no one in his apartment. And Sammy's trying to get him to call the police, but Chris is I can't call the police. What am I going to tell him? That a shadowy figure is coming in my apartment and choking me? They're going to think I'm crazy. Chris decides he's going to approach this head on. Maybe that woman in San Francisco did put some curse on me. I need to go at least research it. And so there was a religious bookstore right near his house that he figured might have some things on demonic possession and demons, the occult. And he goes in there and he kind of awkwardly approaches the store owner and is like, I'm looking for, books about demons and witchcraft and how to protect yourself against that. And the guy points him towards a section of the store. And so Chris goes over there, he scoops up a whole bunch of books. He also buys a whole bundle of crucifixes. So at least 10. So he's got all these crucifixes, he's got all these books about demonic possession and witchcraft. He buys all of that and he leaves and he goes back to his apartment. When he gets back after doing some research, he ends up putting these crucifixes all over his apartment, every room. And he takes salt and he draws a line all through his apartment against the baseboard of every wall in the house. And at every corner of the house, he'd pile up little piles of salt. He was going to do all the things that people say to do if you're dealing with demons or ghosts or anything through witchcraft. He was kind of grasping at straws a little bit. So he went out and did everything he thought he could possibly do to protect himself. That night, which was April 16th, we don't know what happened to Chris, but something scared him so badly that in the middle of the night, in a full panic, he runs out of his apartment and he checks into a hotel and does not stay at his apartment. The next morning, April 17th, when Sammy called Chris to check on him. Now remember, this is 1999. There was just landline phones. So she calls his landline at his apartment to check on him. There's no answer because he's not there. He's at the hotel. And Sammy, who's been speaking to Chris, and other friends that have been speaking to Chris, and everyone's concerned about his mental health and what's going on with him, when she doesn't get Chris to pick up his phone, she calls the police and she says, "Hey, I'm concerned about my friend. Can you do a welfare check on this guy?" And they go over to his apartment and it's locked, and they kind of look in the windows and everything just seems kind of quiet. And so they leave and they tell Sammy, like, "Hey, look, it's locked. We can't really do anything. Let us know if you don't hear from him in the next couple of days." And so that was it. And so Sammy's like super concerned. And so she goes to work on the 17th. And then when she gets back, she has a voicemail from Chris, who had called her at some point during the day while she was out. And on the voicemail, Chris tells her in a voice that was different than the past few days. The past few days, he was scared. He was really scared. This time, he is defeated. He was like resigned to whatever was going on. And he says to Sammy on the voicemail, he's under attack. And that tonight, they're going to kill me. And there's nothing I can do. As soon as she's done listening to the message, Sammy calls Chris, but she can't get in touch with him. She knows she just talked to the police who were there at his apartment that day. They're probably just going to tell her, like, "Hey, wait until tomorrow. We just told you, earlier, just give it a couple days." And so she just decides that she's going to go to bed and she's going to try calling him again on April 18th. On the morning of April 18th, Chris didn't show up for work. And word got back to Sammy, who was already going to reach out to Chris that morning anyways. But, the friends and family are talking about what's going on with Chris. And so word got back to her that Chris had missed work. And so she calls Chris. He's not picking up from his landline. And now she calls the police back and she says, "Hey, you were there yesterday. I know it was locked, but he hasn't shown up for work today. Everybody's concerned about him. Can you please go over and check?" And so the police go back over to Chris's apartment, and this time the front door is unlocked. And they go inside and they're met with this very strange scene. You have all these crucifixes that are on the wall. You have the salt that lines every room in the house. There are all these candles that have burned down to the wick. There are little scraps of paper all over the apartment that were handwritten, little messages that Chris was leaving all over the house, warding off spirits and demons. I mean, it just looked like out of a Hollywood set for some demonic movie or something. And they search the house and there's no sign of Chris. They're yelling for him. There's no sign of him. And they make their way into the bathroom where they discover Chris's body. Chris was in his bathtub. No water in the bathtub. He's fully clothed. There's all these candles all around the outside of this bathtub. There's, more crucifixes and weird relics that are in the bathroom with him. And he's on his knees and he's slouched up against the wall with his hands kind of tucked against his chest. He had no external injuries. He was just dead. And so the police take Chris's body and the coroner comes in and does a report, and it comes out that Chris died of natural causes. He died of a heart attack. And so when friends and family saw that that was his cause of death, they didn't buy it. They were like, "I don't know how to describe what happened to him." But over the past 7 days, Chris went from this happy, healthy, successful guy to a complete raving paranoid lunatic. And no one knows why. It's certainly possible that it was just a very poorly timed heart attack, mixed in with someone having a psychotic break. Or some people say that he really was cursed by that woman in San Francisco and that was the result. She said, "You're going to die within the week," and he literally died within the week. And he described regularly over the phone to his friends and family as this was happening, these horrible experiences at night with these shadow beings in his room and it attacking him. It's just this crazy story that to this day leaves friends, family, and investigators baffled. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the beach with the like button, wait until they take off their sun hat to go run into the water, and while they're gone, fill their hat up with mayonnaise. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of June 29, 1934, a 37-year-old police officer named Captain Alan Falby pressed the throttle on his police motorcycle and sped down a street in El Paso, Texas. Captain Falby's motorcycle lights and sirens were on because he was chasing a speeding pickup truck down the road. But despite the fact that obviously Captain Falby was in pursuit of this person, they were not slowing down at all. So Captain Falby had been a police officer for 11 years, and he loved his job, he loved his motorcycle, and he hated when suspects got away. So he kept his hand on the throttle and kept chasing down the suspect, but suddenly the truck he was going after slammed on its brakes and swerved hard to the left. Falby tried to slow down, but it was too late. He slammed into the back of this truck, and then he and his bike went sliding across the asphalt for a few seconds, and the whole time, Falby is feeling his body getting totally scraped against the pavement, and the wind's getting knocked out of him. And then finally, when he came to a stop, he was splayed out in the middle of the road, and his motorcycle, his beloved motorcycle, was laying on top of him, pinning his legs under him. And this bike weighed like 500 pounds. And adding insult to injury here, as Falby is screaming out in pain because obviously horrible injuries have been sustained here, he looks down the road and he sees the truck he was chasing, who clearly knew he just wrecked behind them. They're not gonna stay and help. They just drove off protecting themselves. And so pretty quickly, Falby kind of assessed the situation he was in. He tried for a second to push this bike off of him, but not only could he not move it, but every time he moved it just a little bit, the weight would kind of come down even harder and a little bit more pointed on his legs, which were crushed, and he had this excruciating pain down there. And worse, he's looking underneath him and he's seeing this growing pool of blood. Clearly, he's sustained potentially life-threatening injuries here, and he's all alone. Like, there's nobody here to help him, and he's totally stuck. And so even though he began calling out for help, the reality was, if nobody came along soon, he was done for. And he found himself starting to panic. Luckily though, just then, 2 men from down the road came running up to Captain Falby. Apparently they had been sort of behind the captain and were watching him pursuing this truck, and they had actually seen the accident. And so they had pulled over, and they were now running up to see if he was okay. And so right away, without even needing to ask Captain Falby what he needed, these 2 men saw the situation. The bike is pinned on top of the cop. And so together, these 2 men were able to lift this heavy motorcycle off of the captain's legs. And as soon as they did, all 3 of them looked, and they could clearly see, the reason there's all this blood all over the pavement. There was this huge gash in Captain Falby's leg right above his knee that was just pouring out blood. And Captain Falby, he saw that, and he was already starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but just seeing this huge wound was totally disorienting. Fortunately though, the 2 men who had arrived on the scene to help Captain Falby kept their composure. And one of them actually noticed that Captain Falby was wearing a necktie. He had a formal police uniform on that had, a necktie as part of it. And he gently reached over and he told Captain Falby to relax, and he undid his necktie. Meanwhile, the other man, he ran over to the side of the road where this big tree was, and he got a stick, a pretty sturdy stick. And so the guy who undid the necktie, he tied it around Captain Falby's leg above the wound, basically cutting off circulation to that wound, a tourniquet. He tied it off, and then the other guy came back over with the stick, and he handed it to the guy with the necktie, and he took the stick and threaded it carefully through the necktie that was now wrapped around the captain's leg, and he began twisting the stick, wrapping up the fabric as he twisted it, which in turn mechanically tightened that tourniquet around the captain's leg, much tighter than you could do, without something mechanical. Like, this is somebody who clearly knew how to make a real tourniquet out of sort of everyday materials. And so they tie off the super tight tourniquet, they stop the bleeding, and it ultimately saves Captain Falby's life. In fact, by the time Captain Falby actually got brought to the hospital and they took off this DIY tourniquet and patched him up for real, the doctor would tell Captain Falby that, he was about 10 minutes away from death from blood loss. So had it not been for those two guys who showed up and made that tourniquet, he very likely would have died. 4 years later, on December 12, 1938, Captain Falby was back at work. And he had been, ever since maybe 6 months after his injury. He had just gone back to work, fully recovered. He did have some scar tissue on his leg, but he was basically back to full capacity. And so on this particular day, Captain Falby was on patrol like he normally was in El Paso when he got a call over the radio about a bad car accident that had happened out on Route 80, which is a major road in that town. And so Captain Falby races over to the scene and he sees there's this car that's clearly veered off the road and smashed into a tree. And the driver, or who appears to be the driver, is sitting still in the driver's seat and they were unconscious. And so Falby was the first on the scene. He pulls over, he gets off his bike, he rushes over to the car and he carefully pulls this unconscious man out of the car and he lays him on the ground. And he sees this guy has a horrible gash in his leg and it's bleeding profusely. But because this basically mirrored the exact same type of injury that Falby himself had had 4 years earlier when he crashed his motorcycle, Falby knew what to do. He didn't have, a issued tourniquet on hand, but he knew how to make one. He had a necktie, and there were sticks on the side of the road. So as quick as he could, he rushed over, grabbed a sturdy stick, took off his necktie, tied it around this man's leg, used the stick to tighten it up even further, and he cut off the bleeding to that wound. And so at this point, now that Captain Falby has realized that, okay, this guy appears to be stable now, he's not actively bleeding, he's clearly still breathing, albeit unconscious, but, it seems like he has a fighting chance here. So he's waiting for paramedics to show up and take this guy to the hospital, and he's just sitting there sort of, happy he was able to be here and save this guy, when he sort of looks at this guy and he realizes something. The man he had just saved with his DIY tourniquet was literally the actual same guy who had saved Captain Falby with a DIY tourniquet 4 years earlier. Captain Falby had never even gotten the guy's name. They had not stayed in touch after his accident. They had gone separate ways. But now he's looking down at this man and he's realizing it's the same one. The guy's name was Alfred Smith, and he would make a full recovery. But when he was rushed to the hospital, they would say, you were within about maybe 10 minutes of bleeding to death had it not been for Captain Falby. So literally, this DIY tourniquet story played out almost exactly the same way with these two guys doing it to each other, but 4 years apart. Later on, Captain Falby and Alfred Smith would give an interview to Ripley's Believe It or Not to talk about the incredible coincidence that saved both their lives. And when the interviewer at some point congratulated Captain Falby on his heroic efforts, Falby simply stated, quote, "One good tourniquet deserves another."
You see, Alfred Smith was the man who put the tourniquet around my leg and saved my life when my motorcycle hit that truck. After all, one good tourniquet deserves another.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I left the military in 2017, I left carrying a lot of baggage that I didn't really know I had. But what I was doing is basically bottling it all up and then snapping at people left and right. And the worst part was that even though I didn't really see this happening or why it was happening, I knew my behavior was destroying relationships left and right. And it left me feeling very stuck and isolated. The people close to me eventually came to my aid and encouraged me to seek professional help, go see a therapist. And admittedly, I was pretty resistant at first. I felt like I, could handle my business on my own. But I did eventually relent and I did see a therapist. And pretty quickly I saw, therapy can give me something that I really couldn't give myself. And that was a truly non-judgmental space to be heard and really talk openly about what was going on in my life. And my therapist gave me lots of perspective that I couldn't give myself, and they taught me methods to cope with my anger and my sadness, and it really kind of turned my life around. Healing is not linear, and you don't have to do it alone. So if you're struggling right now and you don't know who to turn to, consider giving therapy a try. And a great therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp can connect you with a licensed therapist who will listen and help. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballin to get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the evening of December 16th, 1984, a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Hao Ran walked through the courtyard of a pretty low-rent, seedy apartment complex in Hong Kong. He held hands with his longtime girlfriend, 23-year-old Jen Yu. The pair had just finished having dinner together at Hao Ran's apartment, which was part of this complex, but now he was walking his girlfriend across this courtyard to the other side of this complex, where her apartment was located. And so Hao Ran always walked Yu home. The pair had been together for a few years now. They'd actually met in college after a close mutual friend had introduced them, and ever since then, they had been inseparable. And so Hao Ran was just sort of protective of Yu, and he felt like their neighborhood was not very safe, and so anytime, especially at night, when he knew his girlfriend would be sort of out and about in their neighborhood, he would walk with her to keep her safe. And so that's what he was doing tonight. Eventually, the couple reached the front door of the section of this complex that would lead up to Yu's apartment. And so the two walked in through the front door, and they made their way over to the building's elevator bank. There were 2 elevators. Hao Ran reached over and pressed the up button, and then he and Yu just stood there and waited. And as they waited, they began to hear the familiar sound of one of the old elevator cars clanging its way down the elevator shaft. These were old and creaky and really kind of sketchy elevator cars that both Hao Ran and Yu hated riding on. But Yu lived up on the 13th floor, and neither of them liked walking up that many steps, and so it was sort of like, the only other choice is to ride one of these elevator cars. And so eventually the car came down, the doors dinged, they opened up, and nobody was on the car, and so Hao Ran and Yu stepped inside. They pressed 13, the doors rattled to a close, and they slowly began going up. And the whole time they're going up, neither of them spoke. It was just kind of like anxious anticipation that, hopefully this car will make it all the way up to the 13th floor. And so as they're moving up, they're hearing the car banging into the walls, and it's just so uncomfortable. But eventually they do reach the 13th floor, it dings, the doors open up, and both of them are so relieved when they step out of the car onto solid ground. And they make their way over to Yu's apartment, and the two, they give each other a hug and kiss and say they had a really nice time together. And then Yu, she retreats into her apartment, and Hao Ran goes back down the hallway and presses the down button to go back down the elevator. And sure enough, a couple of seconds later, Hao Ran heard the familiar sound of the elevator car shaking and banging against the shaft as it made its way up to him. There was a bell sound, the doors opened up, nobody was on the elevator car. Hao Ran stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, turned around, and watched as the doors closed. And then slowly, he began to go down. And again, as he's going down, Hao Ran had that same sort of nervous energy, hoping this elevator didn't come to a, lurching stop or something, that it just got him down to the ground safely. And so he's going down, it's floor 12, 11, 10, down he's going. And then at floor 7, the car came to a stop. But it was kind of a hard stop, not like emergency status hard, but it was a fairly hard stop at floor 7. And so Hao Ran, he's instinctively thinking, okay, well, clearly someone on the 7th floor has called the elevator, and the doors are going to open any second here, and someone's going to get on. But as he's waiting for the doors to open to alleviate this sudden stress that, oh my God, is something wrong here? The doors don't open. And instead, the elevator suddenly lurches down another foot. It stops. But clearly, this is not normal elevator behavior. There is something wrong with this elevator. Like his worst fears are coming true, and the doors still are not opening. And so Hao Ran's looking around wondering, what's he gonna do? What can he do? He's trying to tell himself that everything's okay. Maybe the doors still will open up, but they're not. And then he begins to smell something. It was almost like a sort of chemical smell. He couldn't really place what it was, and he's sort of looking around, wondering what's going on here, and his panic is rising, like this is a bad situation, has no idea what's happening, but clearly something bad is going on here. And then this already horrible situation gets 1,000 times worse, because he looks down and he sees the floor of the inside of the elevator is now on fire. And as he's realizing the floor is on fire, and that's what he was smelling, as like this burning smell, he sees his own legs are now on fire. And so in a completely panicked, like fight or flight moment, Halron remembered that most elevator cars have an escape hatch somewhere, usually on the ceiling, and he looked up and he couldn't believe it. There it was. There was this escape hatch to get out of the car. And so right away, that's what Halron began trying to do. He kind of scaled the walls of this car. He punched open this hatch and he climbed out of the elevator, out of the fire, saving his own life. And so while all this chaos was happening in the elevator shaft, Halron's girlfriend, Yu, was in her apartment looking out the window. And her view was basically the same courtyard that she and Halron had walked across just, 5 minutes ago to get to her apartment building. And it was sort of customary that every time he would drop her off at her apartment, she would look out the window and wait for him to come out the front door, and she would watch him walk back across that same courtyard to his building on the other side. And so Yu sort of understood how long it would take, for Halron to come down the elevator and walk out the door. But now it had been, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, and he still hadn't come out the front door, and there really wasn't any reason for him not to have exited the building at this point. And she started to get worried. And so given the fact that Yu, much like Halron, was fearful that those old elevators in this building were eventually going to get stuck while they were on them, given she had that fear, she instinctively was like, oh my gosh, maybe he's stuck in the elevator. Like, that's why he hasn't left the building yet. And so instinctively, she left her apartment and walked down the hallway to the elevator bank, and she looked up above the doors, and it showed where the respective cars were located. And she saw that one of the cars was stuck at floor 7, and it wasn't moving up or down. It didn't matter if she pressed the button, that car would not go up or down. The other car would, but not that car. And so it convinced her that Halron has got to be trapped on that elevator car. He's stuck right there. I better call authorities. And so she did. She called the fire department and said, hey, my boyfriend, I believe he's trapped in the elevator. And so just a few minutes later, the local fire department showed up to the apartment complex, and they walked up to the 7th floor where they believed, this car was stuck. Now, they were not in some crazy, emergency mode running down the hall to open up this elevator car, because they're thinking, it's really just an inconvenience getting stuck on an elevator car. It's not like life and death. And so they just make their way up to the 7th floor by taking the stairs. And then on the 7th floor, they go over to the elevator bank where the 2 doors are to the respective elevator cars. And on the one that, shows the car is stuck on floor 7, it says the number right above the door. They use their tools to pry open the doors to see, the car right behind it. And once they pry it open, they do see the trapped elevator car, and it's not exactly where it's supposed to be. It's not sitting, right in front of the door. It's actually situated sort of below the 7th floor. They can basically only see the top of the elevator car. Like, this car has actually gotten stuck between the 7th floor and the 6th floor. But that in and of itself was not a huge thing. I mean, they could basically mechanically move this car up and down if they needed to, either up to the 7th or down to the 6th to get whoever was on the car out. What they noticed right away though, which was the way bigger problem, is they smelled and saw smoke, and it was coming from this elevator car, the trapped car. And so the firefighters immediately go into, okay, we got to figure out where this fire is coming from. Is it coming from this elevator car? Is it somewhere down below at the bottom of the elevator shaft? Like, they don't know. But from their perspective, outside looking into the shaft, they could see that the hatch, the emergency hatch on this stopped elevator car was open because they can see the roof of this car. And they're thinking, okay, maybe the trapped guy is right in there and we can look down, grab him, pull him out, and deal with this fire. And so they go in, they're yelling out Halron's name, and they look down into this elevator car. They're literally on top looking through this hatch, and they see the carpet inside of this car is all charred and burned, and there's some smoke sort of sitting inside the car. But there's nobody inside the car. It's empty, but they see there's blood all over the inside and up on the walls. And then they realize there's also blood kind of coming up, through this hatch, and it's on the top of the elevator car. Clearly, whoever was in this car was badly hurt as they exited out the roof. But now the firefighters are wondering, like, well, where did he go? Did he fall down to the bottom? I mean, because basically there's just these two elevator cars that move up and down inside of this singular shaft. There's basically nothing dividing the two shafts that these elevator cars move in. It's kind of like one big shaft. And so to the side of this frozen car is this huge shaft, multi-story shaft that goes all the way to the ground. And so they look over the edge and they shine their light down the elevator shaft because, the car on this side was up top. It was not obstructing their view. And sure enough, there is a man, maybe one floor down, who looks very badly injured. He's got cuts all over him. He's bleeding. It looked like his ankle was broken. And he was sort of huddled on this very small platform, basically one floor below. At every floor, when you walk onto the elevator, when those doors open up, there's like, a 1 foot long little platform that extends into the shaft just enough that it meets the entrance to the car. So when the car opens up, you walk across this little platform into the elevator, the door's shut and it goes up or down. But if you're in the elevator shaft, each floor basically has that little protrusion, that 1 foot, small platform. And there's the guy, presumably Howron, who is positioned, perched on the one right below them, on that little platform. And so, of course, the firefighters forget the fire, because, that's a separate issue at this point, and they gotta go rescue Howron. And so they go down to the 6th floor, they open up the doors, they grab Howron, they pull him into the hallway where he is safe. He's obviously in an enormous amount of pain, he's been burned, he's got a broken ankle, he's in rough shape, but it appears like he's going to survive. And so as the firefighters placed Howron on a stretcher, and he's barely talking, he's very shaken up, he's just laying there. And so at this point, the girlfriend, she found out the firefighters had saved her boyfriend and he was on the 6th floor, and so she comes charging down the stairs, runs down the 6th floor hallway to be by her boyfriend's side, and she looks at Howron for the first time, and she just freezes. And she stares at him, and she says, "That's not my boyfriend." It would turn out this whole elevator disaster was highly coordinated, because what neither Howron nor his girlfriend knew was that the same mutual friend who had actually introduced the two of them deeply regretted it. He himself was in love with you, and he couldn't bear to see her with another man. And so this mutual friend, whose name was Liu Wenjong, that night, he had secretly waited until he was sure Howron had climbed on the elevator car by himself, and then he had cut off electricity to that car, freezing it at the 7th floor, actually between the 7th and the 6th floor. And then he climbed on top of the elevator car, opened up the hatch just enough to pour kerosene into the car with Howron. That was the smell that Howron began to talk about and smell inside the shaft. Like, he clearly knew there was something off, but Howron didn't realize it was, this friend of his right above him. And then before Howron could even understand what was happening, Liu lit a match and threw it into the elevator car. That was what caused the big fire. But then, when Howron panicked and climbed up out of the hatch to save himself, Liu was waiting for him, and he stabbed Howron and then threw him off the roof of this elevator car, where he fell all the way down 7 floors to the bottom of the shaft, where he died. The man that was crouched on that platform, 1 floor below where this car was Liu. And basically what he did is, after murdering Howron, he leapt onto that platform from the top of this elevator car down onto that platform, sort of intentionally to hurt himself, to make it seem somehow like, he was just trying to help Howron, but then, basically fell and hurt himself too. Like, he didn't do anything wrong, but when they looked at Howron inside the shaft, he was clearly stabbed. And also they knew this fire had been started on purpose. It was clearly arson. And so once all this evidence had piled up and it was pretty obvious that Liu had done it, he did confess, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. One evening in February of 1966, a 34-year-old man named Jose Luis Peña walked down a staircase inside of a cafe in Madrid, Spain. At the bottom of the stairs was this sort of basement seating area. It was pretty quiet, only a few people were down there. But Jose Luis, as soon as he was down there, he saw his friend, Fernando Sesma, had already found a booth on the other end of the seating area, and he was beckoning Jose Luis over. And so Jose Luis, who had come here to meet Fernando, eagerly walked over towards him. And then before he even sat down, Fernando, who was grinning ear to ear, he held up this envelope and showed Jose Luis, like, I gotta tell you about this. So Jose Luis and Fernando were both members of a small club called Baleña Alegre, which means happy whale in Spanish, and their meetings were all about aliens and UFOs. Now, Fernando was actually a post office employee during the day, but at night, he was the de facto leader of this club, and he'd always been fascinated by aliens. As for Jose Luis, he actually was much more of a skeptic. He actually kind of actively did not believe in aliens, UFOs, or anything paranormal. But about a month prior, he'd had this sort of inexplicable, UFO sighting, or he didn't even know what it was. He was driving along and thought he saw something in the sky that didn't necessarily make him a believer. But he didn't know who to talk to about this thing he had seen. He couldn't make sense of it. And so that's how he had found his way into this group. It was just because it was an outlet to talk about this weird thing he had been through. And to be honest, he didn't know if he'd be staying any longer than maybe the next couple of weeks. He was just here for now. But regardless, Jose Luis and Fernando had made plans to meet up in this cafe tonight to sort of catch up on all things about the club, before their actual club meeting that was going to happen maybe 30 minutes from when they were actually meeting. But as Jose Luis is sitting down, Fernando's got this envelope that he's really excited about. And once Jose Luis sits down, Fernando puts it in front of him and he's like, look, there's no return address. And he points, there's like this strange symbol on the outside of this envelope, and it just looks sort of foreign, like Jose Luis didn't really even know what he was looking at. But Fernando, who again is a full believer, he says to Jose Luis, he's like, I just got this letter and I'm gonna show it to the club tonight because I think it's from an alien. Now, when Jose Luis heard this, he was open to the idea of UFOs being a thing because again, he couldn't explain what happened to him, but he just felt like, give me a break. Like, what, an alien sent you a letter? Why? Why would they send you a letter? And he sort of said as much to Fernando, but Fernando, he was ready for this. Like, he knew Jose Luis was a skeptic, and he knew he would cut this letter apart. But Fernando, he took the envelope back, before Jose Luis could say anything more about how fake this was, and he pulled out the letter inside. And the letter, it was typed out, so it wasn't by hand, it was by typewriter. And the writer wrote that they were literally from an alien race called the Umites, and they had come from a planet called Umo. And they said that, the Umites had very advanced technology, and they'd actually already been living on Earth for the last 16 years. However, humans didn't recognize them because they sort of looked like normal people. And so this alien writer said, for all these years, they had been searching for, a true believer to share this secret with. And apparently, the believer they had found was Fernando. Now, Jose Luis could tell that Fernando was really excited, and so he sort of throttled back how much he sort of rained on his parade here, and he just let him have his moment and said, wow, that's really interesting. And then before long, the other members of their club came into this basement seating area inside this cafe. And as soon as they were all assembled, Fernando got up to the front of the room and he held up this envelope and he said, you won't believe it. I got this letter. It's from an alien race. They want to talk to me. Like, can you believe this? We finally have proof. The aliens are here. And unbelievably, as he says this, Jose Luis is looking out to get the reaction of the other folks in the club to see how invested they are, in this new revelation. And Jose Luis can't believe it when others in this club begin reaching into their bags and pulling out identical looking envelopes with these strange symbols on them. And they're like, we got these letters too. We just got them last night. We brought them here for this meeting. Can you believe it? And so the whole meeting was completely dominated by, talks of the Umite alien race and how, these letters have got to be legitimate. Like, this can't be a prank the way Jose Luis said it could be a prank. Like, this has got to be real. Who would want to prank us? We're just this little group that, investigates the paranormal. Like, why would anyone care about pranking us? And Jose Luis said to them, that's why, because you believe in the paranormal and they're playing into that. Like, you're the perfect target to be pranked. That's why this is likely happening. But pretty much the entire club disagreed with Jose Luis, and they reminded him, Fernando in particular, that he should recall the club's motto, which was to believe everything until proven otherwise. Basically, the whole group was demanding that Jose Luis keep an open mind, because this might be the exact moment most of them were all waiting for. A little over a year later, in June of 1967, and Jose Luis was back inside of that basement seating area of that cafe in Madrid, Spain. To this point, Jose Luis had continued attending these meetings of the Balena Alegre. He had thought about leaving a couple of times, especially as this whole Ummite fervor had really took hold inside the club. He didn't buy it, but he had stuck it out and continued attending meetings. But on this particular day, he was here for a very specific reason. It was because he had seen an article in the local newspaper that he knew the club would be really eager to see. So at this point, Fernando actually was writing a weekly column in the newspaper about the Ummites, because shortly after getting that first letter and all the other members of the club getting those letters, he had written to the news, they had been really interested, and asked for weekly updates. And sure enough, over the past year, the club continued receiving these letters, Fernando included, from the Ummites, whoever they were, and he would write these update columns. And really by this point, a year later, that column had become really popular in Madrid. And so people of Madrid were pretty invested in the Ummites and, whatever was happening with them. And also adding to the intrigue was these letters were no longer just arriving on the doorsteps of Balena Alegre members. They were arriving in front of random people's homes all over Madrid. Like random people were being contacted by, this alien race. Now, Jose Luis still very much believed that there is no way this could be real. Like this can't actually be aliens. But the Ummites had basically become the only conversation topic in the club every time they met. Like it was all they ever talked about. And it increasingly felt like it was a lot of what Madrid talked about. I mean, this was a big deal at the time. But today, the reason Jose Luis had brought the newspaper to bring to the group was actually because, they had published something that even to Jose Luis was pretty unbelievable. It wasn't an article that Fernando had published. It was not, another recounting of another letter showing up. It was actually, this newspaper themselves covering what appeared to be a local UFO sighting. And apparently somebody had captured a photo of this, presumed UFO, and that photo had been published in the news. And wouldn't you know, on the outside of this alien craft was that same strange symbol that adorned the front of all the Ummite letters that Fernando and the club members and all people of Madrid were getting from these Ummites. It was the same symbol. And so it sort of felt like for the first time, it was not just, letters that could be fabricated and sent to the masses. It was like this vehicle that had shown up in Madrid that had that same symbol, like it had to be the Ummites. Also, remember, it's 1967, and so faking photographs was very hard to do, at least, making something look convincing. And so that's why Jose Luis, he had brought this newspaper in to show the other members of this club, to be like, what, I gotta say, this is pretty unbelievable. And, the reaction from the club was equally amazed. They had all already seen this photo. I mean, they are completely locked in on all things Ummites. And so this photo was sort of like the centerpiece of that day's discussion. And Jose Luis found himself sort of admitting that, this is pretty unbelievable and I don't know what to make of it. But by the end of the meeting, Jose Luis still cautioned the group, like, look, I know this looks so real and it feels so real. I mean, I'm bringing this to you. I think this is pretty unbelievable. But there's just gotta be an angle here. Somebody has to be faking this. Like there isn't a way that some alien species is doing this. This just doesn't feel real to me. But at this point, it was like everybody shut him down. They're like, hey, you brought this to us today. You're the one saying this is hard to deny. Like this makes it feel real. And so at this point, forget your dissenting opinion. What we need to do as a group is take the news of the Ummites and this photograph and all the letters and not just show it to the rest of Spain, but we need to show it to the whole world. And so sure enough, after that, Fernando began going on TV and insisting the Ummites were real, which actually did cause mass panic across all of Spain. People couldn't explain the thousands of letters and that UFO photo, and so belief in the Ummites really caught on. And while Fernando and seemingly the entire general public of Spain became increasingly radicalized, Jose Luis grew more isolated from his friends in Balena Alegre. And soon he quit attending meetings altogether. And then shortly after that, he began going on TV, but not to advocate for the belief in the Ummites, but the opposite. To say, stop believing in this. There's no way this is real. But nobody really listened to him. The Ummite story had really taken on a life of its own, and it was sort of beginning to spin out of control. A few years after the Ummite letters began showing up and making headlines, 2 men had lied down on railroad tracks and basically taken their own lives by letting the train run them over. And police actually found notes in these men's pockets that just said, "The aliens call us." And given the timing of, their deaths, it seemed like it had to be connected to the Umites. Then 2 Spanish sisters died in a murder-suicide, and police discovered they had been receiving Umite letters that might have contributed to this crime. By the 1970s, there were also multiple Umite-related cults operating in Spain, and one of those cults targeted young boys. And in the early 1970s, when Jose Luis's own son was 7 years old, that child was targeted by one of these cults to be brought in because of his father. Like, they were trying to bring this child in to be exposed to who knows what, just because of Jose Luis's public stature as it related to the Umites. Now, Jose Luis's son would not be pulled into that cult. He would be just fine. But for Jose Luis, this was pretty eye-opening and terrifying. The idea that his family could be targeted because of this Umite stuff was crazy. And so around that same time, Jose Luis stopped trying to tell people to not believe in this stuff and instead retreated from the public eye and just tried to live a quiet, isolated life. Over the next several decades, people all over Spain continued receiving Umite letters, and nobody knew why. And these cults that, sort of focused on the Umites continued to flourish and continued to believe that absolutely the Umites are real. As for Jose Luis, he really did try to live a private life away from all this craziness, but it was hard to escape it. I mean, he would see Fernando on the news all the time talking about the Umites, and he even published a book about it. I mean, it was kind of everywhere. But everything changed in 1996. 30 years after the first Umite letter was received. One night in 1996, people all over Spain gathered in front of their TVs very expectantly as there was going to be this special report about the Umites. And when the guest of honor, who was going to be a big part of the special report, came on screen and began talking about the Umites, it truly shocked the entire country. This person explained that in their own lives, they had recently had a near-death experience, and that experience had made them realize it was finally time to admit to the world that they had made the whole Umite thing up. It really was a hoax. They said they had written those first Umite letters and sent them to Belena Alegre because they believed they would be susceptible to believing in the hoax. And they also said they really did fake that photograph that was put in the newspaper of the UFO with the strange symbol that matched the symbol on all those letters. But the person said, after that, they sort of had no intention to keep up the hoax. However, the story kind of took off, and all these copycats began sending their own Umite letters to random people all over Spain, and then the news picked it up, and it was everywhere. And even though this person was trying so hard to literally tell the world that they faked this thing, nobody listened. The hoaxer was none other than Jose Luis. He literally had done this just to show the Belena Alegre how easy it was to get people to believe in aliens and conspiracies, because that's what people want. He basically wanted to show them that he was skeptical and he had this UFO experience and he was trying to get to the bottom of it, but everyone's like, oh, it's gotta be aliens. And it's like, no, let's step back and be rational. He was trying to prove a point that, look, I faked aliens writing to you and you all believed it. Like, how are we going to actually figure out what's real and what's not? But he wasn't expecting it to take on a life of its own. However, Jose Luis's confession never actually reached Fernando, because Fernando died years before Jose Luis admitted this really was a hoax. And so he died absolutely still believing that Umites were real. And despite the fact there were at least 4 deaths linked to this Umo craze, and also there were all these cults that were doing who knows what, probably illicit and illegal things, also tied to the Umo hoax, despite all that, Jose Luis never faced any criminal charges. He died in 2014. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
শোনো, তোমাকে একটা কথা বলি। চুরিবিদ্যা মহাবিদ্যা, যদি না করে ধরো। আপনার যদি আপনার ছেলের বিষয়ে কথা বলার অধিকার থাকে তাহলে ওয়াইফ হিসেবে আমার অধিকার আছে আমার হাজবেন্ডের বিষয়ে কথা বলার। গত কয়েকটা মাস আমি তোমার সাথে অ্যাডজাস্ট করে চলছি, আর কত দুইটা মাস
একটা পুরুষ মানুষের না এর থেকে বেশি আর কোনো কিছু চাওয়ার থাকে না, কোনো কিছু পাওয়ার থাকে না।
তোমাকে কিচ্ছু করতে হবে না।
না না, তুমি মনে হয় তুমি কষ্ট পেয়েছো, রাইট?
এই শাড়িটা আমি পরে ফেললে তো তুমি সেখানে আর মায়ের গন্ধ পাবে না।
সেটা নিয়ে তোমার একদম ভালো লাগবে না।
তোমরা আবার এসব ভাববে কেন? এই জেনারেশনের মেয়েরা তো এই সমস্ত কথা চিন্তাই করতে পারে না।
মা তাই তুমি এখানে বসো, ওর জন্য আরেকটা জিনিস আছে।
এরকম চিৎকার করে নীলের সাথে কথা বলছো কেন?
মা, আপনি মুরব্বী মানুষ, আমি আপনাকে হাত
কোনো সিন ক্রিয়েট করিনি বাসার মধ্যে এসে। আমি যেন কোনো সিন ক্রিয়েট না হয় সেটার জন্য আমি তোমাদেরকে কিচ্ছু বলিনি।
সালেহা বেগম। থাক থাক হয়েছে। আচ্ছা
মনের বিয়ে নাকি নুনন্তে পান্তে ফোরনের ছেলেটার সংসার করতে কষ্ট হচ্ছে? তোমাদের ঝগড়ে দেখবো আর কি, তোমার ভাই ঝগড়ে দেখতে আমার ভালোই লাগে এখন। এমন সয়ে গেছে আমার।
আমি আর
তোমাকে বরণ করার জন্য যে এলাকাণ্ড করার কথা তার কিছুই করতে পারলাম না। আই এম এক্সট্রিমলি সরি।
ওর কাছে আমার শাড়ি গেল কি করে? কি রে নীল, তুই না বলেছিলি এই শাড়িটা নিয়ে আমাকে যখন মনে পড়বে তখন এটার গন্ধ শুন।
আমার যে তোমাকে একটু সামান্য উপহার, এটা সাদরে গ্রহণ করুন। আপনি ঠিক মতো শুন, আপনার হাত পা একটু আমি টিপা দিই।
থাক টিপতে হবে না, যা তোর বউর কাছে যা।
আরে আমি আসছি তো।
হ্যাঁ।
আমার এই জীবনে না আর কোনো কিছু করার কোনো মরদ নেই, আমার কোনো জায়গাই নেই।
কেন কথা বলবো না? 100 বার কথা বলবো।
কোন সংবিধানে লেখা আছে যে ব্যাচেলারদের বাসা এক কাদা ধুলার আস্তরণ আর ভাজিন? তুমি আমাকে বলেছিলে তুমি আমাকে আগলে রাখবে, তোমার কথায় আমি সব ছেড়ে এক কাপড়ে আমার ঘর।
মা তো প্রায় সময়ই থাকে আমার সাথে। মা তো একটু গ্রামের বাড়ি গেছে, চলে আসবে, টেনশন নেই কিছু না। না খেলে কিন্তু আমার অনেক কষ্ট হবে।
তোমার মা যেগুলো বলে সেগুলোতে বুঝে আমার কষ্ট হয় না? আপনি প্লিজ আমার ছোট ছোট বিষয়গুলোতে এত খেয়াল রাখেন, এতেই আমার ভালো লাগে।